Hi, I'm John Finn, and I'm here to talk to you about 10 reasons you should learn to read music. Number 1, standard notation shows much more detail than tablature does. Think about it. Tablature is much like those numbered feet on the floor of a dance studio, and if you do that, like you follow each of the foot numbers, you end up doing something that looks approximately like dancing, but it surely leaves a lot of detail. Tablature shows you what finger goes on what fret, but beyond that, it doesn't really tell you much about what's going on with the music, where standard notation can talk in a lot more detail about things like articulation, dynamics, timing, pacing, and even can make some notations about the emotional content, which I think is kind of important, don't you? So a lot more detail. 2, a chart without tablature takes up much fewer pages. Think about it. If you have the standard notation and you don't have the tablature staff underneath it, then you can fit more staffs on each page, which means fewer pages. So I think why that's important is if you're practicing, what I like to do is I like to lay out all the pages in front of me on a music stand and try to turn as few pages as possible. So if it's a lot of pages, I might fold a couple of them and turn them as I play, or I might just try to lay them out on multiple music stands if it's more than 4 pages. But if it's 15 pages, I'm not going to lay out 16 music stands. It's just plain not terribly practical. So that's why that's actually kind of important. Number 3, you don't have to memorize everything. You can write it down and read it later. You don't have to commit everything to memory. Now, of course, when you're performing, I think it's important to play from memory. You're going to own the music much more than you would if you don't memorize it, but it also means that you don't have to memorize every single piece of music that you learn. Number 4, you have access to a much larger library of music. If you can read, it means that you can play music that was written for other instruments. You can take out a piece of music written for flute and try to play it on guitar, or saxophone, or trumpet, or even harp, or xylophone. Some instruments translate to guitar better than others, but you can try all of it and sort of decide for yourself what you want to do. So I guess my point is, if you can read, it's just like reading English. Imagine what your life would be like if you couldn't read or understand English. If you can't read English, there's a lot that you're going to be missing, isn't there? Number 5, it allows you to attempt much more complex music in much less time. It kind of goes to the same thing as what I was talking about earlier. If you don't have to memorize it, then you can learn much more complex music. You can spend more time on it. You can linger on some of the more complex phrases and not worry about whether you're going to remember the rest of it because it's all written down in front of you. You can play through everything really slowly. You can work towards studying it and try to understand it better as you play it. It's a great opportunity for growth. Number 6, you're not Jimi Hendrix. Neither am I. I mean, you might be great. I don't know. But the reason why I bring that up as a point is so many people, when they talk about reading music or whether to read music or not to read music, they often cite, well, Jimi Hendrix didn't read. That's true, but I'll tell you this, he was surrounded by players and musicians who could read music and were very literate and were sort of right at his side as he was figuring out how to do some things, and very quick to sort of help him along with things. Now, if you're Jimi Hendrix and you're that successful, you can afford to hire people to take care of those things. So, you know what? If you have Jimi Hendrix money, great, go for it. A guy like me, I never had that kind of access, so I always felt like it was way more effective for me to learn how to read music, so I could take care of things like that on my own instead of having to worry about somebody else doing it for me. 7, it allows you to study music in much greater detail. A few years ago, I bought a book of Bach violin sonatas. There's 6 violin sonatas that he had written, and I tried to play them on guitar. And what I found was that the music is both beautiful and insanely complicated. And a lot of it just didn't sit very well with guitar. In fact, some of it was just almost unplayable on guitar, but I wanted to try to learn to play it anyway because I was looking for a challenge. So what it allowed me to do was to really take the time and study the different things that were going on with it. So if I can read it, then I can understand what's happening with the music, even if I can't hear it yet or play it. And if I can study it, I can learn about it and then eventually practice enough so that I can play it. It's kind of a time-intensive process, but I would not have been able to learn any of that music had I not been able to read it. It would have been flat out impossible. Number 8, it allows you to reinterpret freely in far greater detail. So this same group of pieces, because they were written for violin, a lot of things, as I said before, were sort of unplayable on guitar. So what I had to do was to learn how to play them and then figure out the best way to play them on guitar, which meant that I had to reinterpret a lot of things, which in many ways was great. I was able to reinterpret because the original piece of music was right there in front of me, so I was able to take a pencil and sort of make some notes about some things that I was going to change to try to make it more, I guess, guitar friendly. And I would also have a clear concept of how far I was straying from the original piece of music to try to make it work better on guitar. So I felt good about it, and there was a lot of detail in the reinterpretation because I was able to write things down and not have to memorize everything. Wow, there's kind of a pattern there. Number 9, a good guitarist who reads will work much more than one who doesn't. If you have 2 guitar players of equal ability, one of them reads and one of them won't. The one who reads will almost always work way more than the one who doesn't, for a very simple reason. Sometimes if you become known as a musician, people will start calling you for things, and if they call you and you ask if they ask if you can read, and your answer is no, they'll say, okay, all right, great, well, thank you very much. If they ask you if you can read, it means that they're offering you a gig that involves reading. So if you say yes, of course now you have to prove that you can by showing up to the gig and reading, and that's a different thing. But if you say no right out of the gate, then you're turning away potential work, right? So it makes sense. 10, allows you to interact much more easily with musicians who aren't guitar players. So if you're writing down a piece of music and you're using tablature, that will help you learn to play it. Tablature is useful if you're trying to remember how to play a particular passage. It's an easy way to sort of notate guitar ideas. However, try taking tablature and handing it to somebody who plays flute. It's going to be utterly meaningless because there's nothing about the notation that has anything to do with flute. So if it's standard notation, then the language is going to be universal across from going from one instrument to the next instrument. You know, of course, there are some instruments that are what are called transposing instruments that will play in different keys, but you know, if you can read, that's actually not that difficult to deal with. But just some food for thought. I think if you're serious about being a professional musician, it might be true that a lot of the gigs that you play, you won't be reading on the gigs, but boy, behind the scenes, if you can read, it makes your life so much easier. So Give it some thought. Keep playing.